And I'm blessed to have two other families, my Senate colleagues, who I do regard as my family, and my staff, who I also regard as my family. So although I'm not Irish, I got a big, big, big family, and they're the greatest, all three. With that, Mr. President, I yield the floor, and I thank Sheldon for, again, his graciousness.
Mr. President, I believe that under the pending order, I have the floor, but I would like to yield to the senator from Illinois for a few minutes and then be recognized at the conclusion of his remarks.
Without objection.
I thank the senator from Rhode Island, and I thank the presiding officer. I just want to join my colleague, Senator Schumer, first thanking him for his leadership in bringing us together. With Senator McCain, they led the effort, the 8-senator effort to put together this comprehensive immigration bill, which was enacted by the Senate today by a vote of 68 to 32. Many thanks go around. I've acknowledged the other senators who were part of that gang, but I wanted to give special recognition to 3 of my staffers who really worked overtime and did an extraordinary effort to put this bill together. First and foremost, Joe Zogby, my lead counsel in the Senate Judiciary Committee. He was there at creation when it came to the DREAM Act, and he's been with me ever since. Some 12 years of dedicated effort to pass this legislation on the floor of the Senate. We did it today. It never would have happened if Joe hadn't devoted so much energy and talent into making this day possible. I also will tell you his name is well known among those who are dreamers. So many times he has saved them from deportation when they were just minutes or days away from that happening. He has a heart of gold and a great mind, and I'm lucky to have him. Mara Silver, an extraordinary lawyer who took on aspects of this bill that were tough, refugee and asylee sections that have virtually no constituency. They're sections of the law that really affect some of the most downtrodden and people on earth who face oppression in other countries. She came to it with the heart of a lion and came through with some provisions that will really give many of these asylees and refugees their chance to prove that they need help and deserve help here in the United States. And Vaishali Yildandi, who has been another staffer who sat through meeting after weary meeting, putting together the provisions that we needed to work out. You can't say enough for the staff people when you do this type of Olympic and heroic effort as the creation of this comprehensive immigration reform. I'm fortunate to have an exceptional staff, both in the district, state I should say, and back here in Washington. Those 3 deserve special recognition today for the extraordinary job they did. Mr. President, I yield the floor to the senator from Rhode Island with gratitude.
Mr. President.
Senator from Rhode Island.
Thank you, Mr. President. It has been an extraordinary day in the Senate today, and it shows the kind of progress that can be made even on bedeviling issues when persistence and optimism are brought to bear. And I hope that my continued efforts on climate change will ultimately produce, with the same persistence and optimism, the same success we've seen today on immigration. This is the 37th time that I will have come to the floor to urge my colleagues to wake up to the threats that we face from climate change, to wake up, to stop hiding behind the distortions that are spread by the fossil fuel interests, and to start heeding the warnings of scientists, of economists, of insurers, of businesses, of national security officials, of religious leaders. They all say something needs to be done, and fast, to stave off the harm of carbon pollution. For the first time in this speech, I can say that something at last is being done. This Tuesday, President Obama laid out a national plan to reduce carbon pollution and to prepare our country for the effects of climate change. His plan is a bold one, and it is going to challenge the status quo. Most important, the administration will regulate greenhouse gas emissions from new and existing power plants. If we're going to be serious, we need to strike at the heart of the problem, and regulating these big power plants is the best first step. And let's face it, until now, these big polluters were getting a free ride. They were harming all of us with their emissions and paying no price for it. Carbon-driven climate change hurts our economy, damages our infrastructure, harms our public health. Economists call this price that we all pay the social cost of carbon, because it represents the cost that polluting corporations offload onto the rest of us, onto the rest of society. Earlier this month, the Obama administration revised its estimate of the social cost of carbon to $36 per ton of carbon dioxide emitted. This new estimate better captures the true harm of carbon pollution to our oceans, to our farmland, to ourselves, and I commend the President for strengthening our economic assessment of climate change. The administration's measure still falls short of some experts' calculations, however, such as the comprehensive review that prompted far-reaching climate change legislation in the United Kingdom. I think our estimate should be still higher to accurately reflect the cost of climate change. And I think the best way to address the mounting social cost of carbon is a carbon fee. If we start charging these corporations a fee based on the social cost of their carbon pollution, that will factor those costs into their price, into their business models. And that is Economics 101. A carbon fee, in other words, makes the market work properly by putting the costs of carbon pollution into the price of the product, instead of letting the big polluters freeload on the general public. It's a simple choice. Do we want the American people, children and seniors, small business owners and homeowners, to pay the price of carbon pollution? Or do we want to have the corporations behind that pollution take responsibility for the harm, to balance the energy markets, and to encourage American clean energy technologies? We're already hearing the familiar refrains of the deniers, the skeptics, and the big polluters trying to scare us into protecting the status quo. A carbon fee, quote, slows down our ability to compete, claims one of my Republican colleagues. The cost of nearly everything built in America would go up, declared another. The Speaker of the House warned that if we put a price on carbon, and I quote, the United States economy would suffer, millions of family wage jobs would be lost, and American consumers would incur dramatically higher prices for energy and consumer goods, all without any significant environmental benefit whatsoever. These are scary predictions, but are they true? Actually, the World Wildlife Fund and the Carbon Disclosure Project found that investments to reduce carbon pollution yield greater financial returns for companies than do their overall capital investments. So never mind the huge environmental benefits, cutting back on greenhouse gas emissions by just 3% each year would save U.S. businesses up to $190 billion a year by 2020, or $780 billion over 10 years. And that supports American leadership in new clean energy technologies, powering our economy. So it should overall be good for business. And what about American families? The nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office estimates that a carbon fee starting at around $28 per ton of carbon dioxide emitted, which is within the price range recommended by economists, would result in a 2.5% increase in costs for the lowest income households and a 0.7% increase for the richest ones. It's higher for low-income families because they're likely to spend more of their budget on home heating, on gas, and on other energy. What the carbon fee fearmongers overlook is the substantial revenue generated by a carbon fee. According to CBO, a fee starting at $20 per ton would raise $1.2 trillion over the first 10 years. That revenue doesn't just disappear. When Senator Schatz, Congressman Waxman, Congressman Blumenauer and I put forward a carbon fee discussion draft earlier this year, we left the use of the proceeds from the fee open for discussion. We want to work with other members, particularly with those on the Finance Committee, whose leadership I see here, to find a use for the revenues that puts that revenue to work for the American people and propels the economy. Every penny of that carbon fee revenue could go back to the American people. There are a lot of ways to do this, so let's consider a few examples. We should start by setting aside about $140 billion, or 12% of the total, to help lower-income households pay for their 2.5% cost increase. That would leave us with more than $1 trillion to send back to people in other ways. That's a lot of money, even by Washington standards, and it can do big things.
With the Senator, I hate to interrupt. Would you be willing to yield for 2 minutes so I could thank some people on immigration, and I promise I will take no more than 2 minutes.
Let me respond to the distinguished senator. The answer is yes. I also see our distinguished chairman of the Finance Committee and his ranking member on the floor, and I understand that they have a colloquy they'd like to engage in. Do they have an estimate as to how long they would like to engage in that colloquy?
Senator from Montana.
Mr. President, may I ask the senator from Rhode Island how much time he wishes to... How much time
I
he has
have
remaining?
about another 10 minutes of speaking, and what I'd propose to do, I don't know how long you'd like to take, what I'd propose to do is yield to the senator, Senator Graham,
2 minutes.
for such time as he may need.
2 minutes.
Mr. President, it's fine. I think we should wait for let the senator from Rhode Island proceed, the statement, and if the senator from South Carolina wants to go ahead.
Yeah, that's fine.
Whatever you work out.
Great.
All right, well, I'll yield the floor to Senator Graham.
To all my Senate colleagues, today was a good day, a historic day for the Senate. Thank you all, whether you opposed or supported the bill. It was a great debate. To the staff, this bill could have died 1,000 times. You wouldn't let it. To Matt, you're just awesome. Sergio and David and my staff, thank you for just endless hours of work below minimum wage. Mark and McCain's office, thank you for working for Senator McCain. Your reward will be in heaven. Chandler, you're awesome working for Jeff. Enrique, you're one of the smartest people I've ever met. John, Marco was a game changer. Leon's the star of the show. Stephanie, you kept Leon and Schumer from killing each other. Well done. Joe, thank you for being a strong voice. Kerry, for Bob, you always reminded us that we're dealing with people. And to Sergio and Michael Bennett's office, y'all were a really incredible calming force. To Senator Hatch, you came into the debate at a time when we needed a lift. Orrin Hatch, I want to thank you profusely for jumping into the debate, adding to the momentum that was created by the so-called Gang of Eight. You provided momentum in committee. It meant a lot. To Kelly Ayotte, you jumped on board at a time when people were talking about what was bad with the bill. You came out to give us number 5 after, along with Senator Hatch, to give it momentum. That was an act of, I think, tremendous political courage, and you did the country a service by standing up and standing out at a time when it was tough. To Hoeven and Corker, you put us over the top. I've never enjoyed working with two people more, but to Bob Corker and John Hoeven, your efforts to come up with a new amendment along with Senator Hatch and Senator Ayotte really made the difference. So I just wanted to recognize these people, that they came along at a time when America needed them, and this bill is a result of hard work of many people at the staff level, but key senators who were not in the original bipartisan group came to the aid of the cause at a time we needed it. I will yield. Thank you very much for allowing me to say these words.
Mr. President,
Thank you.
The senator from Utah.
I want to thank my colleague from South Carolina for his kind remarks, and he's right on. A lot of these folks really came to the forefront on this bill. Thank you.
From Rhode Island.
Mr. President, let me also congratulate our friend Senator Graham for his extraordinary leadership on this. Let me ask unanimous consent that I'd be able to speak for another 5 or 6 minutes before I conclude my remarks, and let me further ask unanimous consent that the interruption that we just sustained be moved to the end of my remarks, so in the record they are uninterrupted.
Without objection.
So we were talking about the ways to bring carbon fee revenue back to the American people. We should start, I believe, by setting aside about $140 billion, which is about 12% of the total, to help those lower-income households pay for that 2.5% increase that they will sustain. That would leave us with more than $1 trillion to send back to the American people in other ways. That is a lot of money, even by Washington standards, and it can do big things. For starters, $1 trillion every 10 years would go a long way toward reducing the national debt. Listening to some of the apocalyptic language used by Republicans about our national debt, you'd think that they might be interested in this. What are some of the other ways we could return those carbon revenues? Well, you could send out checks directly to the American people for about $900 per household, or $360 per citizen every year. I know there are plenty of families in Rhode Island that could use an extra $900 a year, and these dividends would go right back into the economy because those families would spend it quickly. Or we could give seniors a raise. According to the Census Bureau, as many as 1 in 7 Americans over 65 lives in poverty. In 2010 and 2011, seniors saw no Social Security cost of living adjustments, even though their costs for food and medicine and heating oil continued to rise. With the revenues from a carbon fee, we could raise the average benefit by $1,600 a year, or $130 a month. Last year, that would have been an 11% raise for every senior. Imagine that. And seniors living on fixed incomes tend to spend every dollar they get. So this money, too, would come right back into the economy. What about students? The outstanding government-backed student loan debt in the country rose to a record $958 billion last year. With $1 trillion in carbon fee revenues, we could forgive all the federal student loan debt that American families are now carrying. Boom, done, gone. Or we could cut every student's and graduate's debt in half, saving Americans $45 billion a year in loan payments next year alone, and double the maximum Pell Grant from $5,500 to a little over $11,000, and still have money left over to permanently set the rate on subsidized government loans for undergraduates at 3.4%. That is the rate currently set to double next month if Congress doesn't act. Or we could use the $1 trillion to lower the top corporate tax rate from 35% to 28%. That reduction was Mitt Romney's corporate tax goal, and we could do it without adding a dime to the deficit. That's why Republicans like George Shultz, Art Laffer, one of the architects of President Reagan's economic plan, and others have expressed support for a revenue-neutral carbon fee. I've highlighted these 4 proposals to show that we could do big things with a carbon fee. These proposals, or some combination of them, or other ideas, are all possibilities opened up by carbon fee legislation. Shouldn't we have that discussion? Wouldn't that be better and more honest and more productive than trotting out the tired tall tales of climate denial, better than pretending that it's a hoax? President Obama has defined the growing menace of climate change as the global threat of our time. It is. It is this challenge by which our generation will be judged. The grown-ups know it. NASA, and NOAA and all the major American scientific organizations, the Joint Chiefs of Staff and our military leaders, a who's who of America's top corporate leadership, the property casualty and insurance industry, the Conference of Catholic Bishops, the list goes on. Mr. President, it is time for us to wake up and meet our solemn responsibility to our country and to its leadership role in the world. And we can do so in a way that allows us to do big things that will help the American people. As the President said, that is our job, that is our task. We have to get to work. I thank the distinguished chairman of the Finance Committee and his ranking member for their courtesy. I yield the floor. I had remarks prepared to deliver on a bill that Senator Baucus and I worked on together, the SAFE Act, which will help from the beaches of Rhode Island to the mountain glaciers of Montana. And I would ask unanimous consent that those remarks be put into the record rather than keep him waiting any longer.
Without objection.
I yield the floor.
Mr. President,
Senator from Montana.
first I very much thank my colleague from Rhode Island for all his work in many areas. A great senator, great statesman, actually, and a great representative of people of the state of Rhode Island, and also for his works on the resource legislation that he mentioned. I think at this point, I want to add my thanks to all those who worked on the recently passed immigration bill. Senator Graham made a point of thanking senators. I want to also thank all the so-called Gang of Eight, Senator Schumer, Senator Menendez, Senator Rubio, Senator Bennett, Senator Durbin, Senator Graham, Senator Flake, and Senator McCain for their great work. They worked very hard to get that bill together. And, of course, Senator Corker and Senator Hoeven, who came up with the key amendment to put the bill over the finish line. And hats off to the chairman of the Judiciary Committee, Senator Leahy, and, of course, our leader, Senator Reid, who helped marshal all those efforts. I think they did a great job, and there's no end to the commendation that they should receive. Mr. President, on a totally another matter, the philosopher Bertrand Russell said, and I quote him, "The greatest challenge to any thinker is stating the problem in a way that will allow a solution." I come to the floor today with my good friend, Senator Orrin Hatch, to state our concerns about a national problem that's holding back our economy. We're here to call on our colleagues to provide ideas that will allow a solution. First, the problem. Mr. President, America's tax code is complex, it's inefficient, and acting as a brake on our economy. Senator Hatch and I believe it is in need of serious overhaul. It has been close to 3 decades since the last major revisions to the tax code. In that time, Congress has made about 15,000 changes to the tax code, 15,000 over 3 decades. The code now contains nearly 4 million words. Here it is, right here, the tax code. This is America's tax code, all 24 pounds of it. Paperback. Just think how heavy it would be for hardcover. It would take more than 18 days, nonstop, to read the tax code. In fact, it takes the average taxpayer 13 hours to gather and compile the receipts and forms to comply with the code. And it costs Americans $160 billion a year just to comply with the code, let alone the taxes Americans pay. This complexity in the code is eroding confidence in our economy and creating uncertainty for America's families and businesses. Clearly, the tax code is broken. That's the problem, and it's a serious one. The solution calls for a more simple, more fair tax code, one that will allow the economy to grow and to create jobs. For the past 3 years, Senator Hatch and I have been working closely with all the members of the Senate Finance Committee to reach that goal through comprehensive tax reform. We've held more than 30 hearings. We've heard from hundreds of experts about how tax reform can simplify the system for families, help businesses innovate, and make the U.S. more competitive.
Mr. President.
Senator from Utah.
I want to thank my friend from Montana for all the hard work that he has done with regard to the Senate Finance Committee and, of course, this tax set of problems that we have in this country. He's been truly dedicated to reforming our nation's tax code and truly dedicated to doing it in a bipartisan manner, which is something I very much appreciate. Our work together is starting to pay off. Tax reform is building momentum. Over the past 3 months, we have issued 10 bipartisan options papers, I should say, that detail reform proposals in every area of the tax code. The full committee has met on a weekly basis to discuss these options. We've made tremendous progress. We are now entering the home stretch, all of this under the leadership of Senator Baucus. Senator Baucus and I are here today to call on all of our colleagues in the Senate to now provide their input to help us get tax reform over the finish line. We have a historic opportunity to do tax reform in this Congress, to make the code simpler and fairer for the people we serve. We are determined to make it happen, but we need every member's participation. In order to make sure that we end up with a simpler, more efficient, and fairer tax code, we believe it is important to start with a blank slate. A tax code without all of the special provisions in the form of exclusions, deductions, and credits, and other tax preferences that some refer to as tax expenditures.
Mr. President, I might say this blank slate is not, of course, the end of the discussion. We don't just clear the decks and stop. Some of the provisions in the code obviously serve very important objectives, and that's why in the main it's there in the first place. And some we'll need to keep, clearly. Why? To make sure the tax code is at least as progressive after tax reform as it is today. And I want to emphasize that this approach is just a starting point. It's not a proposal. This is just a good, fair, balanced way, a good faith way, including all members of the Senate to get started. And we believe it's going to lead to a solution, kind of the way that Bertrand Russell suggested. You got to state the problem the way it's going to lead to a solution. We think this is a good way to get to that solution.
Mr. President, indeed, we both believe that some existing tax expenditures should be preserved in some form. But the tax code is also littered with preferences for special interests. To make sure that we clear out all the unproductive provisions and simplify the tax code, we plan to operate from an assumption that all special provisions are out unless there is clear evidence that they, number one, help grow the economy, number two, help make the tax code fairer, or number three, effectively promote other important policy objectives.
Now that we have a blank slate, we're asking all senators, that's all senators, senators on the committee, senators off the committee, to submit detailed legislative proposals. And that is what they think, that is tax expenditures, which they, as tax expenditures, you know, the credits, the deductions, exclusions, which they think should be added back, that is, meet the test for growth and for jobs, as well as any other provisions that senators might have in mind that they think should be added, or any repeals that they think make sense, or other reforms that they think make sense. In order to help guide our colleagues' submissions, we've released some rough estimates that the Joint Committee on Taxation and our staff's been working on. These estimates show how much the rates would rise, for example, if we add back tax expenditures and keep the current level of progressivity compared to a blank slate. And we put this out today. Why? Because we wanted everybody to know there's a trade-off involved. That is, when you keep tax expenditures, there's going to be an increase in rates, certainly compared with what otherwise would start with. And the more tax expenditures there are, the less revenue there is for rate reduction and deficit reduction, and the more complicated our tax code will end up being.
We're giving senators 1 month to send us their submissions. We will give preference to bipartisan proposals. This input will make up the foundation of the committee's tax reform proposal. We want to ensure that the bipartisan bill we introduce has broad input and buy-in from across the Senate. We can't let comprehensive tax reform get bogged down in politics. Only a bipartisan bill can become law.
We also need to remember this is not just about tax expenditures. There's much more to it than just confining our discussion to tax expenditures, because at its core, tax reform means making the tax code more fair, easier to deal with for families all across our country. And there are a lot of loopholes, on the other hand, in the code that we should get rid of. People who can afford fancy tax advisors shouldn't be able to take advantage of loopholes that regular Americans don't have available to them. And as chairman and ranking member of the committee, we are determined to complete tax reform at this Congress. We cannot afford to be complacent. Improving the tax code provides a great opportunity to spark economic growth, to really create jobs and make United States businesses more competitive. I might add at this point, Mr. President, other countries are modernizing their code, and we're going to be left in the dust if we don't modernize ours. So we need to hear from our colleagues as to what provisions they think can help us reach those goals. I have a great partner in this mission, my good friend Senator Hatch, and I'll keep communicating and working with the administration and the Senate leadership to move the ball forward, because working together we can get this done. I believe strongly that nothing of consequence ever happens around here. One person tries to accomplish something alone on his behalf or her behalf. Rather, matters of consequence are accomplished when people work together. And we clearly want matter of consequence to pass here, and we will do so by working together.
Mr. President, it is a privilege to work with Senator Baucus, our chairman, on improving the tax code, on updating it for the 21st century. This provides a great opportunity to give families certainty, spark economic growth, create jobs, and make the United States businesses more competitive. If it's done right, it can really provide America with a real shot in the arm. My friend from Montana began this discussion with a quote, and I feel it only appropriate to conclude with one as well. Abraham Lincoln said, quote, "Determine the thing that can and shall be done, and then we shall find the way," unquote. We are determined to craft a fairer and simpler tax code. Working together, I think we can find the way. And I want to compliment the distinguished senator from Montana for the work he's already done, for the work the committee's already done, the hearings we've held, the meetings we've held on these options papers, and for his general zeal in leading the charge here on this question of shall we or shall we not reform our tax code. If you look at that stack of tax code books that stood this high, you realize that it's time to simplify that doggone mess. And I think we can do it, but it's going to take a bipartisan effort. It's going to take all of us working closely. It's going to take everybody on the Finance Committee doing the things that it really takes to bring tax reform alive. In 1986, it took 3 years to get the 86 bill done. I don't think we have 3 years. I think we're going to have to do it now, or it won't be done. So I just want to personally express my admiration and friendship for the distinguished senator from Montana. I intend to help him every step of the way. And I believe we have a tremendous contingent of senators on the Finance Committee, as good as any time that committee has been staffed in the history of the Finance Committee. The senators we have there are all solid. They're all fully embracing this in the sense of trying to come up with the very best reform we can. And I have to say we have, I think, the best staff that committee's ever had as well. And that's saying something because it's always had great staff. The Finance Committee has always been one of the greatest committees in the Congress, as it should be. And I have to say, under the leadership of the distinguished senator from Montana, it's no exception this time. We have great people on the staff, and we intend to see if we can get this done. I want to thank my colleague for his great work in this area.
Thank you, Senator. It's mutual. I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from New Hampshire.
Mr. President, is the Senate in a quorum call?
It is not.
Thank you. I rise, Mr. President, to congratulate all of those people who worked so hard on immigration reform. I think it was a tremendous success for this Senate to address an issue that has long been outstanding in this country, and to come to a resolution that got such strong bipartisan support. But despite that success, one of the things that we were not able to do is to address what's going to happen with student loans, which, without any action by Congress, we know that subsidized direct student loans will increase on July 1st from 3.4% to 6.8%. There are a number of proposals currently on the table, and there are negotiations underway, and I think all of that is positive. But as we think about the challenge that our young people face, it's important that we think about getting rid of obstacles that prevent them from going on to college, from getting degrees in higher education. Last month, I had the privilege to speak at the commencement ceremony at Keene State College, one of New Hampshire's great public colleges. The students were celebrating their graduation. They were eager to put their education to work and find meaningful employment. Their optimism, their sense of hope, and their enthusiasm to make a difference was palpable. And as I looked out across the audience that afternoon, I knew that a number of those students, probably up to 66% according to national statistics, had borrowed money to get their degree. These students and their families viewed higher education as so important that they were willing to take on significant loans to get that degree. And it made sense for these students, particularly since recent studies have shown that higher education is one of the key factors driving upward mobility in the United States. In fact, earlier this year, the Pew Foundation's Economic Mobility Project showed that even during the most recent economic downturn, a four-year college degree provided protection in the labor market for recent college graduates. So making college affordable for our students is essential to growing this country's economy. It's essential to creating jobs. It's essential to protecting the middle class. And it's essential to providing those future opportunities for our young people. Now, on the one hand, we know that we've got to make higher education more affordable and available to our young people. And yet, on the other hand, over the last 30 years, tuition and fees have increased 167% at private four-year colleges and 257% at public four-year colleges. Now, if we adjust that for inflation, that means that tuition has increased faster than the cost of gasoline, health care, and other consumer items. So, as we're thinking about how to deal with these student loan interest rates, it's important that we provide some protection for our students, because if we don't, we're going to price middle-class families out of a higher education. In my state of New Hampshire, the student loan debate is especially critical, because last year and for several years before that, New Hampshire has had the highest average student loan college debt in the country at a little over $31,000 per student. Not only do we have the highest average loan debt, we also have the second highest percentage of students with debt in the country. So as I listen to these young people, I know that the high cost of student loans is financially crippling. And we've heard from some of those students who talk about the challenge that they face as the result of the cost of their student loans. Julianne from Gilmanton wrote that her education is crushing her. She earned a master's degree, and now she works for a New Hampshire state agency, and she's an adjunct faculty member at 2 local colleges. To finance her education, one that she thought and that people told her would guarantee her a job after graduation, Julianne took out more than $220,000 in loans. Last year alone, she paid over $13,000 in those student loans, and she can't buy a house, she can't secure credit. Even though she makes a respectable income, she says she can't really pursue being an active member of the community because she's got those student loans hanging over her head. Lauren Bowden is another young person we've heard from. She graduated from West High School in Manchester a couple of years ago, and she went on to get an undergraduate degree in biology. So she's getting her degree in the STEM subjects, one of the things that's so important to the future of this country. But when she graduated, she looked at her job options, and after considering some entry-level jobs that paid $25,000 to $30,000, she decided she needed to go on and get a master's degree, that was going to provide her better opportunities. Well, she's now 22. She's enrolled in a Master's of Biology program, and she's accumulated already over $100,000 in loans. She's concerned about struggling to find a job, and she writes, "I'm not alone. This is an entire generation of my peers in this country who did the same. We followed our dreams. We earned our degrees because this is America, and you can be what you want to be as long as you work hard. We have worked so hard. We will keep working hard. But will it be enough?" she questions. "What will it be like for our kids when we're still burdened by our loans after we start families and our kids want to go to college with even higher tuition and borrowing rates?" Recently, I had a chance to speak with Barbara Ruth Lane, who's the Executive Director of Financial Aid at Granite State College, one of our other public colleges in New Hampshire. Last year alone, Barbara and her colleagues helped students access $9 million in federal loans, significant help for students who want to get that advanced degree and need financial help to do that. But Barbara's quick to point out that the number of students helped and the amount of financial aid they've received doesn't really illustrate the human cost that those loans take on a student. To illustrate the point, she told me the story of a student who lives in the North Country of New Hampshire. That student's 35 and she has 2 young children. She struggles to make ends meet. She gets child support sometimes, and she supplements that income with food stamps. She visits the local food pantry. Her children get clothing from the local church. In the winter, she gets some fuel assistance, not enough because we've had to cut the fuel assistance program. So she borrows money from her family to use a kerosene heater on cold nights to heat her home. But this student understands that education is her only way out, the only way she can break the cycle of poverty. So she met with counselors at the Granite State College. She developed an educational plan. And though she's being careful in borrowing, the debt that she's going to graduate with is more than she has earned ever in her working years in 1 year. And while her education is going to prepare her for the job market, she knows the payoff isn't immediate, that she's going to continue to struggle to make the payments on those student loans and to care for her family. And with a budget like she's dealing with, any additional cost of those student loans is going to impact this woman and her family. Like so many of us here, I've been moved by these students who work so hard to achieve their education goals and the jobs of their dreams because they recognize that education is an investment, that higher education is a path to middle-class success, to economic opportunity. I think that higher education is one of the best investments we can make in our country. It's important not just to those young people who are getting their degrees to give them the jobs that make them prosperous in the future that they're going to be able to support families on. But it's critical for America to compete in the global economy that we're in. We should be doing everything we can to make America a magnet for jobs, to ensure our workers have the skills they need to compete, and to help Americans get ahead. And we've got to do everything we can to make sure that we keep higher education affordable for our young people, that we don't address those costs and try and balance the costs of higher education on the backs of our students. So I am hopeful that we will continue to work on how we address the student loan interest rate, that we'll be able to come to some agreement on how to do that in a way that's not going to cost our young people their futures, that's not going to cost America its future, that's not going to price families out of the cost of higher education. Thank you very much, Mr. President. I yield the floor.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
Senator from Colorado.
Thank you, Mr. President, and I'd ask the quorum call to be vitiated.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. I first want to say to you how wonderful it's been to serve with you in the United States Senate, and as you take your leave to go back to the real world in Massachusetts, we all wish you well, and we thank you for everything that you've done when you've been here, especially the good cheer that you brought to our caucus. So thank you very much. And in the vein of thank yous, I wanted to come down after this historic day, passing this historic bill, to say some thank yous. I already thanked my colleagues in the Gang of Eight and other senators that worked so hard on this bill, so there'll be time to do that on another occasion. But sometimes people have asked me during the course of my checkered career, how did you get to do this, and why did they let you do this, and how did somebody with no apparent skill or aptitude for public education, for example, get to run the Denver Public Schools, one of the most cherished things I've ever done? And my answer has always been the same, which is the key is to find a bunch of people that are better at doing their job than you would ever be at doing their job, and assemble them and get them organized around a project or a challenge or an obstacle, and let them do their thing. And the presiding officer spoke eloquently about this yesterday, and when he thanked his personal staff and the Senate staff on his way back to Massachusetts. And I have a list of all the staff in the senators' offices that worked on this bill, and I'll take time tonight to just mention a few names. First of all, people on my staff, including Rachel Velasquez, Stephanie Artoon, who did amazing work, both of them over many, many months on this bill, not just here, but also as we worked on the Colorado Compact in the state of Colorado. That was what really enabled us to be part of this conversation. I have thought throughout this process how important the work was that we did in Colorado in preparation for this moment. and to get to this moment. And it simply would have been impossible to succeed at producing what we called the Colorado Compact, 6 principles that were so bipartisan that when we had the press conference, the person that came to read the first of these principles was actually my Republican opponent in the 2010 Senate race, Ken Buck. I want to thank him for that and the others that were part of the compact, and especially my Deputy Chief of Staff, Sarah Hughes, who did just an amazing job pulling everybody together. She's been with me longer than anybody on my staff. Nothing I could have accomplished in the jobs that I've had before, and certainly not in this instance, could I have done without Sarah Hughes. And the same goes for John Davidson, who's my Chief of Staff and who is, I think, a model for what a Chief of Staff in the United States Senate should be, or anywhere else for that matter, but particularly here where the pressures can be so extraordinary. His ability to attract an incredibly talented team of people to work on all kinds of issues, from immigration to health care to education, incredibly important constituent service that we do both here in Colorado. Simply, none of it would have happened if somehow I hadn't been lucky enough to hire Jonathan Davidson, who's been around this place. Actually, he's a young person. He's been around here for a very long time, having been, among other things, Paul Sarbanes' Chief of Staff when he was the chair of the Banking Committee. And by my side, both before I came to Senate and in the Senate on this issue, has been Sergio Gonzalez, who has worked tirelessly, doesn't even capture it, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. It's felt like. He certainly looks that way. You won't appreciate my saying that, but it's true. And those people that know Sergio will know what I'm talking about. But he's done an amazing job with a sense of humor, and I think has served not just me during this, but the entire Gang of 8, and we will be forever grateful. And there are many times during this process when I have thought about Sergio's grandfather and his grandmother's grandfather, Corky Gonzalez, Rudolfo Corky Gonzalez, who played such an important role in Colorado's history and the history of the West, for whom a library was just named last week, and what he would think about knowing that we live in a country where his grandson has helped to shepherd across the line the most important immigration reform in this country's history. So I thank Sergio Gonzalez for his leadership as well. None of this would have been possible without Chuck Schumer, and I talked about earlier. None of it would have been possible without his incredibly capable staff, Leon Fresco, Stephanie Martz, and Mike Lynch, his Chief of Staff, all of whom did an extraordinary job of keeping us on track and keeping Chuck on track, and I deeply appreciate that. The others I wanted to mention while I was on the floor today are the staffs of the people we negotiated the agriculture provisions of this bill. Dianne Feinstein did a great job leading that effort. Chris Thompson, Neil Quinter, Kim Alton, who all work for her. I deeply appreciate their work. From Orrin Hatch's office, Matt Sandgren did an excellent job all the way through. And I particularly want to say thank you to Marco Rubio's staff and their efforts to bring Democrats and Republicans together on this issue. You know, this is the first time we've ever had an immigration bill, Madam President, where the agriculture provisions in the bill are endorsed by both the growers and the Farm Workers Union. That has never happened before. I want to thank all of them for doing that. We would not have accomplished that without some very, very late-night meetings. And Enrique Gonzalez was always there, and John Basilisi, he will never forgive me for that. Enrique will never let me forget it. Just did extraordinary work on that part of the bill and other parts of the bill as well. I'd like to thank the leader's staff, Serena Hoy, the Judiciary Committee staff, and the floor staff. And I, as I say, have submitted names for the record, but there's some names here that too often are not mentioned on the floor of the Senate, and I want to read these names. These are the schedulers for the 8 senators that worked on this bill so hard for so many months. I knew the day I knew we were actually going to get this done was the day John McCain said in his office some months ago, he said, unless we begin to meet 3 times a week, We're never going to get that done. As the President knows, that's an enormous commitment of time to be able to do it 3 times a week, and we did it, week in and week out. Sometimes we weren't even in Washington, back home on the telephone, but we carved out the time to do it, and that could not have happened without the schedulers in our office, and from my perspective, certainly not without Kristen Mollett, who's my extraordinary scheduler. I told her when we were first interviewing, I don't know if I was interviewing her or she was interviewing me, it was probably a little bit of both, but what I said to her was, the scheduler is the heart of the operation. If the schedule doesn't work, the wheels come off and nothing else works. And Kristen Mollett has done an extraordinary job getting us through this process. So, in no particular order, let me please say thank you to Alice James with Senator Graham, Megan Runyon with Senator Flake, Rob Kelly with Senator Menendez, Claire Russell with Senator Durbin, Jessica Bonfiglio in Senator Rubio's office, and a very special thanks to Alex Victor with Senator Schumer and Ellen Cahill in Senator McCain's office. We could not have done it without them. And this story that I told people before I came here, when I was a superintendent, I was working in business, not in politics. I'd never run for office before when I took this job. That story about how that I mentioned earlier, that the key is finding people a lot better at doing their job than you would ever be at doing their job. That has never been more true than it has been in the United States Senate, where the quality of the work we do depends entirely on the quality of the staff we have. So I want to say thank you to all the Senate staff for your efforts. And with that, Madam President, I will yield the floor.
I suggest the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
Well, the U.S. Senate has pretty much finished work for the week and for the month ahead of the July 4th recess, passing earlier today the immigration bill by a vote of 68 to 32 after 3 weeks of debate in the Senate. The Senate bill increases border security and workplace enforcement. It allows additional workers to immigrate and creates a path to citizenship for illegal immigrants already in the U.S. The legislation also would double the number of Border Patrol agents to 40,000 and complete 700 miles of fencing along the U.S.-Mexico border. Again, passing earlier today in the House by a vote of 68 to 32. The immigration debate now turns to the House of Representatives. House Speaker John Boehner has said he will schedule a vote on immigration legislation only if it has support from a majority of House Republicans. While this quorum call continues in the U.S. Senate, we're going to bring you some of the final debate in the Senate today on the immigration bill, starting with Florida Senator Marco Rubio.
My father had a rough childhood. His mother died just 4 days shy of his 9th birthday. The small catering company that his parents ran together had collapsed, and so as a young child, he was forced to leave school and go to work. He would work virtually every day for the rest of his life. My mother grew up just as hard. Her father was disabled by polio as a child, and he struggled to provide for his 7 daughters. My parents met at a small store where my mother was a cashier and my father was a security guard. He actually lived and slept in the storage room of that store. Now, like all young couples, they had dreams. My mother wanted to be an actress, and my father tried hard to get ahead. In fact, after work, he would take correspondence courses to become a TV and radio repairman, but it was hard because he barely knew how to read. They did everything they could to make a better life, but living in an increasingly unstable country with limited education and no connections, they just couldn't. So they saved as much as they could, and on May 27th of 1956, they boarded an airplane to Miami. They came to America in search of a better life. Now, like most recent arrivals, life in America wasn't easy either. My father had someone actually phonetically write on a little small piece of paper the words, "I am looking for work." He memorized those words. Those were literally the first words he learned to speak in English. He took day jobs wherever he could find them. They both went to work at a factory building aluminum chairs. My dad started working as a bar boy on Miami Beach, eventually becoming a bartender. He saved money and tried to open up some businesses, and when that didn't work, they tried Los Angeles, they tried Las Vegas, but that also didn't work, and so he found himself back on Miami Beach behind a bar. The truth is they were discouraged, and they were homesick for Cuba, too. In fact, in the early days of Castro's rule, before he came out as a Marxist, they even entertained going back permanently. But of course, communism took root in Havana, and that became impossible, too. Now, I'm sure that on their worst days, they wondered if it would ever get better. And then the miracle we know as America began to change their lives. By 1967, they had saved enough money to buy a house. It was within walking distance of the Orange Bowl, where on Sundays they used to make a little extra money by letting people park on their lawn. My older sister was in ballet. My brother became the star quarterback at Miami High. But it wasn't just their lives that changed. It was also their hearts. Now, they still spoke Spanish at home, and they kept all the customs that they brought with them from Cuba. But with each passing year, this country became their own. My mother recalls how on that terrible November day in 1963, she wept at the news that her president had been slain. And she remembers that magical night in 1969, when an American walked on the moon, and she realized that now nothing was impossible. Because you see, well before they ever became citizens, in their hearts, they had already become Americans. It reminds us sometimes that we focus so much on how immigrants could change America that we forget that America has always changed immigrants even more. This is not just my story. This is our story. It reminds us of the words etched on the marble above the rostrum of the Senate, E pluribus unum, out of many, one. Now, no one should dispute that, like every sovereign nation on this planet, we have a right to control who comes in. But unlike other countries, we are not afraid of people coming in here from other places. Instead, inspired by our Judeo-Christian principles, we Americans have seen the stranger and invited them in. And our nation has been blessed for it in ways that remind us of these ancient words. God divided the sea and led them through and made the water stand up like a wall. By day he led them with a cloud, by night with a light of fire. He split the rocks in the desert. He gave them plentiful to drink as from deep. He made streams flow out from the rock and made waters run down like rivers. And he commanded the clouds above and opened the gates of heaven. He rained down manna for their food and gave them bread from heaven. Our history is filled with dramatic evidence that God's hand is upon our land. And who among us would dispute that we, Americans, are a blessed people? In the harbor of our most famous city, there's a statue of a woman holding a lamp. At the base of that statue, there's a poem, and it reads, "Keep, ancient lands, your storied pomp. Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free. The wretched refuse of your teeming shore. Send these, the homeless, tempest-tossed, to me. I lift my lamp beside the golden door." For over 200 years now, they have come in search of liberty and freedom, for sure, but often just in search of a job to feed their kids and a chance at a better life. From Ireland and Poland, from Germany and France, from Mexico and Cuba, they have come. They have come because in the land of their birth, their dreams were bigger than their opportunities. Here they brought their language and their customs, their religions and their music, and somehow they've made them ours as well. From a collection of people from everywhere, we became one people, the most exceptional nation in all of human history. And even with all our challenges, we remain that shining city on a hill. We are still the hope of the world. Go to our factories and our fields. Go to the kitchens and construction sites. Go to the cafeterias in this very capital. And there you will find that the miracle of America is still alive. For here in America, those who once had no hope will give their kids the chance at a life they always wanted for themselves. Here in America, generations of unfulfilled dreams will finally come to pass. And that's why I support this reform. Not just because I believe in immigrants, but because I believe in America even more. I yield the floor.
Appreciate the excellent remarks from the heart of my good friend Marco Rubio. He is a great addition to the Senate. And I would say the heart of America is good. The heart of this country is good. For 30 years, they've been pleading with Congress to keep a generous immigration policy afoot in America, but at the same time, they've been pleading with us to end the illegality. And that has continued for years now. It just has. And the people have pleaded with us to do something about it. And year after year after year, Congress has refused. The President has refused. And that is why we now have 11 million people in the country illegally. And I think the heart of America is good, and they're willing to deal compassionately and not try to deport 11 million people. They want to do the right thing about this. But by a 4-to-1 margin, they have said they want to see this Congress do what members of Congress have repeatedly promised and never delivered on: create a lawful system, a system we can be proud of, a system that serves the national interest. So as I explained this morning, rather than working with law enforcement groups and prosecutors and considering the needs of everyday citizens, the sponsors of this bill have spent months in negotiation with special interests and lobbyists to produce a bill that will not work. That's the problem we have before us today, that will create even more lawlessness in the future. I want my colleagues to hear what our nation's immigration officers, men and women on the front lines, have to say about this legislation. Shouldn't we listen to them? They asked to be able to participate in these secret negotiations, and they were rebuffed. I asked that they be allowed to participate, and they were rebuffed. A bill that Senator Schumer, let's hear what they say about the bill. The bill that Senator Schumer said in committee was tough as nails. The TV ad that's been running says the toughest bill in history, maybe the history of the world. Well, is that correct? I have to ask. I think not. This was a joint statement issued today by the councils representing immigration and customs enforcement officers, the ICE officers, and the United States Citizenship and Immigration Service officers, a joint statement, two associations representing these thousands, tens of thousands of officers. They say this, quote, now shouldn't we listen to what they're saying? Please listen, colleagues. Quote, ICE officers and USCIS adjudication officers have pleaded with lawmakers not to adopt this bill. The Schumer-Rubio-Corker-Hoeven proposal will make Americans less safe, and it will ensure more illegal immigration, especially visa overstays, in the future. It provides legalization for thousands of dangerous criminals while making it more difficult for our officers to identify public safety and national security threats. The legislation was guided from the beginning by anti-enforcement special interest, and should it become law, will have the desired effect of these groups, blocking immigration enforcement. This is an anti-public safety bill and an anti-law enforcement bill. We urge all lawmakers to oppose the final cloture vote on Thursday and to oppose the bill, which we will be voting on soon. And they go, close quote. And then they say this, quote, and we call on all Americans to pick up the phone and call their members of Congress, close quote. So who do we trust on this question of whether or not we have a bill that will work? Our good political senators who work hard but haven't been out on the front lines doing the work, or to the people we pay who try to do the work every day, putting their lives at risk? And there's something else I'd like to talk about today, just touch on, and I think it's one of the least discussed parts of the conversation. We'll have others talk in more detail, I'm sure, about the enforcement failures of the legislation. But in many ways, this could be the most important. I know our friends in the media certainly hadn't given a lot of coverage to it, but I hope we will think about it more. And that's future flow of immigration for America, or the legal immigration part of the bill that controls the legal flow in the future. CBO tells us that our Congressional Budget Office tells us that the bill's large increase in mostly lower-skilled legal workers will push down wages and increase unemployment. Push down wages and increase unemployment. That needs to be talked about. It must be understood fully. Hundreds of people are hurting today. There was an article recently in the New York Times. I think 700 people camped out for 5 days to get a few jobs as elevator repairmen. They spent in the rain, they camped out, they waited in line, hoping to get one of those jobs. There was an article involving Philadelphia where individuals who had had prior felony convictions, maybe not all felonies, who wanted work, and they set up an opportunity for them to apply to find a job. They expected 1,000, 2,000 showed up, and they interviewed a number of them, and the stories they gave were heartbreaking. Don't we need to consider the impact this policies could have on working Americans? It's a sensitive topic, but a crucial one. Here's what David Cameron, the Prime Minister of the UK, England, a British Prime Minister, said recently, quote, "There are those who say you cannot have a sensible debate because it's somehow wrong to express concerns about immigration." Now, I think this is nonsense. Yes, of course it needs to be approached in a sensitive and rational manner, but I've always understood the concerns, the genuine concerns of hardworking people, including many in our migrant communities who worry about uncontrolled immigration. They worry about the pressure it puts on public services, the rapid pace of change in some of our communities, and of course the concerns deeply felt that some people might be able to come and take advantage of our generosity without making a proper contribution to our country. Mr. Cameron goes on to say, "It is our failure in the past to reform welfare and training that meant that we left too many of our young people in a system where they didn't have proper skills, they didn't have proper incentives to work, and instead we saw large numbers of people coming from overseas to fill vacancies in our economy. Put simply, our job is to educate and train our youth, not to rely on immigration to fill the skill gaps," close quote. Does that resonate with any of our people today? Have we thought through this as to how we should handle these matters? Let's look at our own situation right here in America. 21 million Americans are unable to find full-time work. 1 in 3 without a high school diploma are unemployed. 47 million Americans are on food stamps. Labor force participation is the lowest since the 1970s. The percentage of Americans actually working is lower and has been continually falling since the 1970s. Or not been falling since the 70s, but it goes back to that date when women were just beginning to enter the workforce. 1 in 3 youth in our nation's capital are living in poverty. It appears we are in an era of a new normal. Economists have been talking about this. A new normal where we see lower growth in developed economies than we normally would see. There's more robotics out there, and businesses are looking to contain the growth of employment, and low job creation has been the result. Our own Congressional Budget Office. Madam President, I would ask I be notified after 20 minutes.
The senator will be notified.
I thank the chair. Our own Congressional Budget Office has done a 10-year economic projection, as they do every year. They did this in January, unconnected to immigration. And they found in the second 5 years of our 10-year window, 2018 through 2023, we would only create, they said, 75,000 jobs. I know some will say, well, we're going to bring in workers and that's going to create jobs. But we'll talk about what economists really say about that. But what does this legislation do? I think this legislation has not given thought to the plight of these unemployed Americans. Colleagues, the legislation that's before us today adds 4 times more guest workers. These are people who come only to work, and not just seasonal workers. They come for years at a time with their families, but they come specifically to take a job. 4 times more than in the 2007 bill that failed, and many objected to on the grounds that it would hurt workers. It also triples the grants of permanent status awarded to legal immigrants over the next decade relative to current law. That's a result of the legalization process here. Experts who've looked at, and other factors, experts have come to the same conclusion. There would be at least 30 million people who would be given legal status over the next decade, whereas normally we would give 10 million people legal status. Yet to this day, the sponsors of the legislation have refused to tell us how many would come in to the country. What we do know is that the plan is not a merit-based plan, but mostly a lower skill, meaning it will hurt our poor and working-class citizens the most. We have data that shows that. This will be a hammer blow to poor and working-class Americans. As the Civil Rights Commission members, 2 of them wrote us. They had hearings on this. They said it's going to devastate poor workers. They say we don't have a shortage of lower-skilled workers. We have a glut of lower-skilled workers. And that's a direct quote from their letter. So let's compare our current situation when the legislation was introduced in 2007. Today, 5 million more Americans are unemployed than in 2007. 20 million more Americans are on food stamps. And unemployment among teenagers is 54% higher than in 2007. Meanwhile, median household income, get this, median household income is 8.9% lower than in 1999. That's huge. Professor Borjas at Harvard, himself an immigrant who studies immigration and economics, has said a large part of that decline is driven by the large immigration flow that comes into our country. This would increase it dramatically. We want to have immigration. We're not going to stop immigration. We're going to maintain a generous immigration flow, but the people need to know this bill increases it dramatically. And CBO did a report on the legislation. This is what they found unequivocally. The legal immigration surge in this bill will reduce average wages for a decade. Reduce average wages for a decade. Our own CBO said. It's a chart in their report. I had it on the floor earlier. And wages will remain lower for many years after that than if the bill had never passed. What about unemployment? The number of people out of work, it will increase, according to CBO. And per capita, GNP will be lower for the next quarter of a century. Yes, you're going to have an increase in GDP, and our colleagues are quick to say that because of a large new group of people, but that increase per person in America is not, doesn't occur. It reduces the per capita GNP. And these are extremely conservative estimates. Dr. Borjas, in his report, suggests the situation would be worse than this. Well, to whom do we owe our allegiance? To the groups that want more people in high-tech world or agriculture world or meatpacking world or other businesses? Or to the American citizens who work hard, pay their taxes, fight our wars, and obey our laws? Who is speaking up for their legitimate interest? So the time is long past, as Prime Minister Cameron has said, for a national discussion over legal immigration policies. We all believe in it. No one proposes ending immigration. It's a deep part of our tradition as a nation. But a nation not only has a right, but a duty to establish a responsible flow that promotes assimilation of those who come here, promotes self-sufficiency and rising wages, and helps identify people who can flourish. The last thing we want to do to invite people to come to America to work and find out there's no jobs for them here, or that they're putting Americans out of work in order to get a job, that doesn't make sense. We have not had the kind of discussion of this we need. But the data indicates, objectively speaking, that this will be a detriment to working Americans. A great nation needs a policy that promotes its legitimate national interest, that considers the tough time workers are having today as a result of high unemployment and falling wages. a policy that rejects ideas that will pull down even further the wages of hurting workers. Well, that could, as Senator Sanders has said, create a permanent underclass in America. It's a dangerous thing. We need to do it right. The legislation before us is a dramatic step. I urge my colleagues to reject the bill and to work on a positive reform plan that serves the national interest of all Americans, immigrant and native-born. Sadly, this legislation does advance the interest of those who wrote it, many of them with very special interest, but at the expense of the general public. Now, the vote we're about to have is for final passage. The promises of an open and fair process have been as hollow as the promises that this bill would be the toughest ever and will end the lawlessness in the future forever. It just won't happen. Our law officers have told us this. This legislation is amnesty first. The illegality occurs first. It plainly lacks the kind of mechanisms that are necessary to create a law enforcement system that will work. There is a lack of commitment to that. You can see it throughout the bill. It's not written by people who are out there every day and who know the problems with enforcement. If it were, they would have fixed so many of these problems that are fully shown throughout the bill. Yes, more money has been promised with the recent amendment for the border, but that's in the distant future. But what about the rest of the bill? The E-Verify workplace enforcement system is terribly flawed. It's been delayed. It could be put to work right now. We don't need to wait 5 years as this bill does. It's in place. Why it would be delayed that long is beyond me. Unless you're not very intensely interested in getting started and making sure that after people are legalized, others can't come in and take the job who enter illegally. The entry-exit visa system in this bill, this S-744, 1,000-page bill, is much weaker than current law. Current law says you must have a biometric entry-exit system at sea, air, and land ports. This bill says you only have to have an electronic system at air and sea ports, making the system incomplete and unable to identify who stays and who is returned home on time. Interior enforcement is much weaker. Read the passionate letters from my law enforcement officers, as I've read this morning, pleading with us not to pass the bill because they say it will hurt enforcement and weaken national security. The method of processing those given legal status will not work. The Citizenship and Immigration Service, who manage this, is one of the big objectors to the bill. They say there's no way they can accomplish what will be asked of them if this bill were to pass. They say it would lead to lawlessness and they'll be unable to identify dangerous people who should not be in the country. I thank the chair. I'll be wrapping up. Far from having fines pay for the cost of this amnesty, as the sponsors are now, the Obamacare provision that was supposed to ensure that persons who were given legal status didn't get subsidized health care, now provides an incentive for businesses not to hire American workers because they'll have to pay the Obamacare premiums, but would hire foreign workers, the legalized illegal workers who are now given legal status. They would be having multi-thousand-dollar advantages in hiring them over American workers. So the legislation will not work. Let's continue to work through all these problems together. I do feel that our bill sponsors are clearly correct to say that we need to fix this broken system. A bill that will respond to the pleas of the American people for a lawful immigration system that serves our national interests and in which we can take pride is what I will support. How can we vote for a bill that our own Congressional Budget Office says will reduce average wages in America for 12 years? We've got in this group of American workers thousands, millions of immigrant workers, millions of minorities and African Americans and others at low wages. And this legislation, at a time they're hurting very, very badly now, will reduce average wages for 12 years, will increase unemployment, and will reduce per capita GDP for over 25 years. This is policy we've got to ask serious questions about. All this at a time of high unemployment, long-term falling wages, surging welfare, and disability and dependency. It's not a healthy trend in America. We've got to ask these questions. Our real focus, as Prime Minister Cameron has said, should be to work hard to train our people, our unemployed, our young people, for jobs that pay a decent wage, have a health care, and a retirement plan. This legislation will not end the lawlessness, as our professional officers have repeatedly told us. It will not do so. It will give legality, amnesty if you want to call it that, virtually immediately. And there's a promise of enforcement in the future, but our officers say it will not happen. It's not going to happen now. And I believe they're correct. I had the honor to be a federal prosecutor for quite a long time, and I know law officers, and I know their difficulties, and I totally agree with them. This was a letter that was written today from the ICE officer head, Mr. Chris Crane, a true patriot who's worked so hard to do this. He said, one of the problems with the bill is a failure to enforce the nation's immigration laws on the interior of the United States. It's not just a border issue. It cannot and will not end as a result of increased border security. It must be resolved through increased interior enforcement. 40% of all the illegal immigrants currently in America did not illegally cross the border, but entered instead legally with a visa and did not leave when that visa expired. 40,000 Border Patrol agents provided in your legislation will never come into contact with these people. You hear that, colleagues? These Border Patrol agents are not never coming in contact with the people who are in the interior who came on a visa and chose not to return. He goes on to say, systems like E-Verify and biometric entry-exit, still missing from the bill, may identify millions of illegal immigrants and status violators, but ICE officers will not exist to locate and apprehend them, rendering the system useless. The majority of foreign nationals identified by these systems will remain in the United States. 500,000 ICE fugitives are currently in the United States. 500,000. 2 million criminal aliens at large in the United States. 900,000 criminal aliens are arrested by local police each year. And they go on to note there are only 5,000 ICE officers in America. And this administration sues state and local governments who try to help the ICE officers get their job done. And then the joint statement today from the ICE and USCIS Officers Association say this, quote, ICE officers and USCIS adjudications officers have pleaded with Congress not to adopt this bill, but to work on real effective reforms for the American people. This bill, they say, is an, quote, anti-public safety bill and an anti-law enforcement bill. We urge all lawmakers to oppose the final cloture vote today and oppose the bill. Madam President, this legislation will not end the lawlessness. I wish it were different, but that's the facts. It does not create a merit-based future flow as has been promised, and it leaves us in a very difficult position. So I feel like that there's no choice for us today. So let's vote no on the legislation. It's not going to end the efforts. we're going to have to continue to wrestle with this. The good news is that the House, at least initially, what I've seen in their work, indicates that they're giving a far more prudent approach to it. The first bill that they've produced, I tried to offer as an amendment but did not get brought up, really has an effective effort at improving interior law enforcement. That's the kind of thing we need to be doing. Then we can win the confidence of the American people, and we can move past this very difficult time in our history. I thank the chair and reserve the balance of the time on this side.
The senator from South Carolina.
Thank you. If I may,
Well, thank you very much. To my good friend from Alabama, you've been consistent. You've conducted yourself incredibly well. You're a man of passion, and I agree with David Cameron and Jeff Sessions. Let's have a debate about immigration. But I'm in the camp, let's stop talking about it and doing something. So this bill, in my view, is a giant step forward in many ways. Number one, for the Senate. We're at 10 or 12% in approval rating in Congress. My question is, who are the 10 or 12% and what the hell do they like? I'm in the body, and I don't disapprove of what we've been doing. But I see this as a significant step toward the United States Senate being able to work together in a bipartisan fashion to do something that matters. Is this bill perfect? Is it like, no? Is it like Senator Sessions described? No. It is a good solution to a hard problem that can always be made better. But to the American people, you've got to be frustrated by your Congress not being able to do the hard things, and sometimes even the simple things. This should give you a little bit of hope that for the first time since 2007, the United States Senate, in a bipartisan fashion, is about to pass legislation on an important topic that's emotionally tough but needs to be dealt with. To the critics, I appreciate the debate this time around. It's been so much better. But some of the criticism I'm going to address. Senator Rubio spoke in the most eloquent fashion about his family's history and about who we are as Americans. But everybody has a story. Marco's story is an exceptional story. I'm the first person in my family to go to college. Neither one of my parents graduated high school. My dad and mom ran a restaurant, a liquor store, and a pool room. And I learned everything I need to know about politics in the pool room. Great place to learn about people. But one of the critics of this bill, one of the organizations said that the average illegal immigrant has a 10th grade education. Well, all I can tell you is you got a United States senator who came from parents that didn't have a 10th grade education. To those who believe that how long you go to school determines your character, how much money is in the bank determines your worth, they really don't understand America. Only in America can you do what Senator Rubio's done, and my parents have long since passed. When I was 21, my mom died, 17 years younger than my dad. We thought he would go first, but life just is not so understandable and predictable. She went first.
Be determined by me in consultation with Senator McConnell. The Senate proceed to executive session to consider calendar number 97, that there be 1 hour for debate equally divided in the usual form. Following the use leading back at that time, the Senate proceed to vote with no intervening action or debate on the nomination. The motion to reconsider be considered made and laid on the table with no intervening action or debate. That no further motion be in order, that any related statements be printed in the record, and that President Obama be immediately notified of sense action and assent then resume legislative session.
Without objection.
I now ask unanimous consent that on Monday, July 8th of this year at 5 p.m. the Senate proceed to consider the calendar number 90, which is a nomination. That there be 30 minutes for debate equally divided in the usual form. Excuse me. Equally divided in the usual form, that upon the use leading back of that time, Senate proceed to vote with no intervening action or debate on the nomination. The motion reconsider be considered made and laid on the table with no intervening action or debate, and that no further motion be in order, that any related statements be printed in the record, that President be immediately notified of the sense action. The Senate then resume legislative session.
Without objection.
By unanimous consent, the time to be determined by me in consultation with Senator McConnell, the Senate proceed to executive session and consider calendar number 186, that there be 1 hour for debate, equally divided in the usual form, that following the usual reading back at that time, the Senate proceed to vote with no intervening action or debate on the nomination. The motion to reconsider be considered made, laid on the table with no intervening action or debate. No further motion be in order that any related statements be printed in the record, and President Obama be immediately notified of such action. The Senate then to resume legislative session.
Without objection.
I now ask consent that the Senate proceed to executive session and consider calendars the following nomination: calendar 145, 146, 177, 181, and 183, 188, 190, 195, 196, 197, 198, and all nominations in the Secretary's desk in the Air Force, Army, Coast Guard, and Navy. That the nominations be confirmed en bloc, the motion to reconsider be considered made and laid on the table with no intervening action or debate. That no further motion be in order to any of the nominations. Any related statements be printed in the record, and that President Obama immediately notified of the Senate's action.
Without objection.
I ask consent that we now I ask that the Commerce Committee be discharged for further consideration of Presidential Nomination 121, Presidential Nomination 500. That the nomination be confirmed. The motion we consider, there's two separate ones, Madam President. The nominations be confirmed. The motions to reconsider be considered made and laid on the table. There be no intervening action or debate. No further motion be in order to the nomination. Any related statements be printed in the record, and the President be immediately notified of the Senate's action, and the Senate then resume legislative session.
Without objection.
I ask unanimous consent. The Senate consider calendar number, now move to consider calendar number 187. That the Senate proceed to vote with no intervening action or debate. The motion we consider be considered made and laid on the table. There be no intervening action. I ask unanimous consent, Madam President, that the Senate proceed now to executive session to consider calendar number 187, that the Senate proceed to vote with no intervening action or debate, that the motion reconsider be considered made and laid on the table with no intervening action or debate, that no further motions be in order to the nomination, that any statements related to the nomination be printed in the record, that the President be immediately notified of the Senate's action, and the Senate then resume legislative session.
Without objection. The clerk will report the nominations.
Nomination: Howard A. Shalansky of Pennsylvania to be Administrator of the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs.
The nomination, all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed say no. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes do have it. The nomination is confirmed.
I now ask unanimous consent the Senate proceed to calendar.
Under the previous order, the Senate will resume legislative session.
So sorry. I ask unanimous consent the Senate proceed to calendar number 90, H.R. 1151.
The clerk will report.
Calendar number 90, H.R. 1151, an act to direct the Secretary of State to develop a strategy to obtain observer status for Taiwan at the Triennial International Civil Aviation Organization Assembly and for other purposes.
Without objection, the Senate will proceed to the measure.
I ask the bill be read a third time passed. The motion we consider be considered made and laid on the table with no intervening action or debate.
Without objection.
I ask unanimous consent the Senate proceed to H.R. 2383.
The clerk will report.
H.R. 2383, an act to designate the new Interstate Route 70 bridge over the Mississippi River connecting St. Louis, Missouri and southwestern Illinois as the Stan Musial Veterans Memorial Bridge.
Without objection, the Senate will proceed to the measure.
I ask, Madam President, the bill be read a third time, three times, and passed. Motion reconsider be considered made and laid on the table. There be no intervening action or debate.
Without objection.
I now ask unanimous consent the Banking, Housing, and Urban Affairs Committee be discharged from further consideration H.R. 324, and that we now proceed to that matter.
Clerk will report.
H.R. 324, an act to grant the Congressional Gold Medal collectively to the 1st Special Service Force in recognition of its superior service during World War II.
Without objection, the committee is discharged, and the Senate will proceed to the measure.
I ask consent the bill be read a third time, passed, and motion reconsidered be laid on the table with no intervening action or debate.
Without objection.
I now ask consent that we proceed to S.Res. 192.
The clerk will report.
Senate Resolution 192, commemorating the 150th anniversary of the Battle of Gettysburg and the significance of this battle in the history of the United States.
Without objection, the Senate will proceed to the measure.
I ask unanimous consent the resolution be agreed to, the preamble be agreed to, the motion reconsidered be laid on the table with no intervening action or debate.
Without objection.
I now ask the Senate proceed to S.Con. Res. 19.
The clerk will report.
Senate Concurrent Resolution 19, providing for a conditional adjournment or recess of the Senate and an adjournment of the House of Representatives.
Without objection, the Senate will proceed to the measure.
I ask unanimous consent the concurrent resolution be agreed to, the motion reconsider be laid on the table, there be no intervening action or debate.
Without objection.
I ask unanimous consent that S. 1238 and 1241, both of which were introduced earlier today, be considered read twice and placed on the calendar.
Without objection.
I ask unanimous consent that S. 744 as amended and passed by the Senate be printed.
Without objection.
I ask unanimous consent that Friday, June 28th through Monday, July 8th, Majority Leader and Senators Mikulski and Reed be authorized to sign duly enrolled bills or resolutions.
Without objection.
I ask unanimous consent that notwithstanding the upcoming recess or adjournment of the Senate, the President of the Senate, the President pro tempore, and the majority and minority leaders be authorized to make appointments to commissions, committees, boards, conferences, or interparliamentary conferences authorized by law by concurrent action of the two houses or by order of the Senate.
Without objection.
I ask unanimous consent that when the Senate completes its business day, it adjourn and convene for pro forma sessions only with no business conducted on the following dates and times, and that following each pro forma session, the Senate adjourn until the next pro forma session. July 28th at 12:15 p.m., Tuesday, July 2nd at 10:15 a.m., Friday, July 5th at 12 p.m. Let's start those over again. First, Friday, June 28th, 12:15 p.m., Tuesday, July 2nd at 10:15 a.m., and Friday, July 5th at 12 p.m. And that's Senate adjourn on Friday, July 5th till 2 p.m. on Monday, July 8th, 2013, unless the Senate receives a message of the House. From the House, it is adopt S.Con. Res. 19, the adjournment resolution. And if the Senate receives such a message, the Senate adjourn until 2 p.m. on Monday, July 8th. And on Monday, following the prayer and pledge, the morning hour be deemed expired. Journal of proceedings be approved to date, and the time for two leaders be reserved for use later in the day. And the following any leader remarks, the Senate being a period of morning business until 5 p.m. The Senators permitted to speak for up to 10 minutes each. The following morning business, the Senate proceed to executive session of the previous order.
Without objection.
Madam President, I appreciate your patience and all the staff. I would have come here sooner had I been able to, but they were still trying to work on this material so that we could close for the work period we're going to have at home. So the next roll call vote will be at 5:30 p.m. on Monday, July 8th. And if there's no further business to come before the Senate, I ask that adjournment of the previous order.
The Senate stands adjourned until 12:15 p.m. tomorrow, unless the Senate receives a message from the House that it has agreed to S.Con. Res. 19, in which case the Senate stands adjourned until 2 p.m. on Monday, July 8th.
After 3 weeks of debate,